Yeah, welcome back to the session. We are starting with more substantive contributions of Karl Marx. We are beginning with a discussion on his intellectual influences on Karl Marx when he began to think about a host of issues that was affecting his time in the society. So, I hope you remember that in yesterday's class we had a very brief overview of the person, his family life, his personal life, and the kind of the major features of his intellectual contribution. Marx, as we discussed yesterday, is a very extremely important social thinker who was a political activist, who was a philosopher, who was an economist, who was a sociologist. So somebody unlike any other social scientist or social theorist of his time or even after that, Marx was as an extraordinary person, extraordinary intellectual figure. So that is why, as we are going to see in the coming classes, the contributions of Karl Marx, the kind of ideas that generated by Karl Marx are even now extremely relevant. So in this class, we are going to understand the kind of intellectual influences on Karl Marx. What were the ideas, what were the theories that really shaped Marxian thinking, or what were the kind of intellectual atmosphere in which Marx really developed his theories. You know that no theorist is able to, or no theorist simply comes up with his own ideas which are completely uninfluenced by others. Every thinker, for that matter, reflects over, critically engages with a series of ideas and theories and then arguments of his time, and then improvise upon them, critically engages with them, and then come up with his own arguments. So in the case of Karl Marx as well, there has been a series of major intellectual traditions or major philosophical arguments that were raging at his time, and Marx really very creatively responded to these debates, and that is the reason why Marx was able to come up with his own original contribution. So it is extremely important that we get some fair idea, some basic idea about the kind of intellectual background, intellectual atmosphere of Marxian time. So he has had very systematic or very intense engagement with vibrant debates in philosophy, history, politics, and political economy in Berlin, France, and England. And as we have seen in the previous classes, the time that we are discussing, the 18th and 19th century, really represents a very unique period in the history of Europe. It is a period that has seen quite a lot of social, economic, and political discussions and debates, and a host of major changes, host of very extremely sweeping transformations in the European history. So Marx was able to very creatively engage with, Marx was able to very creatively reflect upon the kind of debates that took place in a series of disciplines, including philosophy, history, politics, and a host of other disciplines in many of the European countries. So he became interested in the emerging fields of political economy, the kind of the field that looks at the connection between politics and economy, not in economics in a very rather strict sense of the word, and economics through the writes of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Friedrich Engels. And Engels, as we discussed in the previous class, became his lifelong companion, lifelong intellectual benefactor, intellectual contributor, and Friedrich Engels plays a very important role in the academic as well as personal life of Karl Marx. And one of the most important influence on Karl Marx is this philosopher George Hegel, whom we are going to discuss. And Marx was also heavily influenced by neo-Hegelians and anarchists, whom we are going to see in down the line. So these are the at least three major intellectual strands that influenced Marxian thinking during his time. So his engagement with anarchists. Anarchism, it always rings a very negative sense. We usually tend to think that anarchism is complete lawlessness. The anarchists are the people who really want absolutely no law, and which must allow any person to do whatever he or she wants to do. But anarchism as a philosophical tradition, anarchism as a kind of a particular ideology is much more deeper. It is a much more radical, and many times you can even call it as a romantic understanding about a completely emancipated state of being, a completely free form of existence in the world. And during Marxian time, anarchism was extremely important. Anarchism was extremely powerful as an ideology. So anarchism was one of the dominant revolutionary ideas of his time that argued against the domination of state, capitalism, private property, and so on, and imagined a more free, independent life for human beings. So most of the anarchists whom we are going to discuss, whether it is Bakunin or Proudhon and a host of other people, they believed that human beings are kept in the chains, and a host of institutions, including modern nation state and capitalism and private property, are really hindering the true spirit or the true freedom of human beings. So they vehemently argued that these man-made institutions need to be abolished so that human beings can live in a much more freer, independent world. And especially they were very much against private property, and they saw, or they identified state as a completely oppressive mechanism. They did not see anything positive about the state. They did not see anything positive about the economic system of capitalism. Rather, they argued that these institutions are imposing unnecessary restrictions on the freer life of people, which do not enable them to live their life as normal or completely independent, free human beings. So Marx had very serious discussions with Bakunin, and for example, he argued against you know that Marx, or we will discuss in the coming classes, that that this industrial proletariat, or the workers, are the central category through which Marx envisions a revolution, or workers occupy the most central role in Marxian scheme of things, because they are the agents who will bring about a revolution. But Bakunin also wanted to include agricultural peasants, and the ideas about nature of the state. There was serious discussions and disagreements between Bakunin and Karl Marx about the nature of state. While Bakunin was vehemently against the very idea, Marxian understanding was much more nuanced. Another very important anarchist, and who also can be termed as an young Hegelian, was Proudhon. With whom again Marx had a series of engagement and very bitter rivalry, bitter forms of engagement through polemics. For example, Marx wrote a book, Poverty of Philosophy, as a response to Proudhon's work on the philosophy of poverty. So Marx, especially his younger period, he grew up as a person who very fiercely fought with, very fiercely engaged with the kind of arguments and theoretical debates that surrounded his life in Western Europe. So these strands of thought, especially anarchism and then Hegelianism, played a very important role in shaping his independent thinking. So Marx shares anarchist criticism of the limitations of representative democracy and the importance of decentralized participatory democracy as an alternative to centralized state. So as I told you, the whole idea of representative democracy and so this was one of the major themes of discussion, because these anarchists were extremely critical of the kind of democracy that was happening, because they argued that in the name of democracy it was always the rule of a few, and the vast majority of the people do not really get to represent themselves, and Marx had a series of engagements with them. For Marx and anarchists, the experience of participation in making social change is central. While there were a series of disagreements and then debates between Marx and anarchists, they also had a series of issues in which they found agreement. For example, both of them, both anarchists as well as Marx, believed that social change is something that is a prerogative of human beings. Human beings are not, powerless entities who will simply flow along with the tide of social change, but rather they are the active makers of social change. So they believed that making social change is central. Human beings have the ability to define their destiny. Human beings have the ability to shape their destiny. So there was major agreement between anarchists and Marx in that sense, as human beings as the active agents of social change. And They also had very important consensus about the centrality of labor, labor as an identity, and as an identity forming activity for workers. So they placed so much of importance to the whole process of labor. Labor was never seen as an activity so that for which you are remunerated to meet your basic needs, but rather they identified labor as something more defining human character. And that is why they place so much of emphasis on labor unions. Liberation cannot be granted to workers, it must be earned by the proletariat themselves. So both of them, both Marx as well as anarchists, believed that the workers have a central role to play. Workers as a collectivity, workers as a group of people who occupy a very specific role in the society, they have an important role to play in defining the history of its time. So that is what they say, liberation cannot be granted to workers because it cannot be defined by or defined on the terms set by others. Rather, they must be earned, or the liberation must be defined and it must be earned by the proletariat themselves. A very, very important revolutionary idea which has the potential to unsettle quite a lot of conventional and conservative understanding about society. Another very important or the most defining influence in Marxian life was this great philosopher George Hegel. One of the very difficult philosophers, one of the most complicated philosophers of modern period. So Hegel, Marx was extremely influenced by Hegel, especially during his early period. He identified himself as he was heavily influenced by this young Hegelians, a group of intellectuals who were influenced by Hegel's work. But later, Marx became one of his most stringent critics. And we will see that the kind of development, the kind of arguments, the kind of twists and then revisions that Marx provided to Hegelian thought. So in four main books, which are the Phenomenology of Mind, the Science of Logic, the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and the Philosophy of Right, Hegel developed one of the most original, complex and obscure philosophical doctrines ever devised. And that is why Hegel is considered to be one of the most important philosophers of modern time. It was original, at the same time it was quite obscure, not very easy to understand. So Marx transformed Hegel's philosophy into an empirically based social science, decisively rejecting Hegel's idealism while retaining his reliance on dialectical analysis and applying it to the material world. So this particular point really captures the central relation between Marx and Hegel. So as I mentioned a bit early, Marx was heavily influenced by Hegel. He was earlier attracted and later he became its critic. At the same time, he borrowed certain ideas of Hegel and then he transformed certain ideas of Hegel in order to come up with his own original thesis, which is widely known as historical materialism or dialectical materialism. So we need to really specifically, very pointedly look at what are the specific points that Marx accepted and what are the specific arguments that Marx rejected. So Marx transformed Hegel's philosophy into an empirically based social science. So Hegel was a philosopher who presented quite a lot of abstract philosophical arguments, whereas Marx converted many of those ideas into empirically based social science. Marx was a philosopher, of course, but also as you will see, or as you might be aware, Marx was a social scientist who was able to transform his philosophical ideas into the theories of sociology, theories of economics, and the kind of a specific narrations on history. So while Hegel was a philosopher, Marx was a philosopher as well as a social scientist. And his social science was heavily influenced by the philosophical angles or philosophical contributions of Hegel. And he decisively rejected Hegel's idealism. So this is the point where we come across the kind of a fundamental conflict between, or fundamental disagreement between these two people. Marx was a materialist, whereas Hegel was an idealist. And we will see what do these terms mean in the coming classes. But this is a fundamental difference. Hegel was an idealist who gave primacy to ideas. He believed that social change takes place as a result of changes happening in the realm of ideas, whereas Marx believed that social change happens mainly because of the changes in the material conditions. So they are in the philosophical tradition, they are seen as kind of binaries, a kind of diametrically opposite concepts, while retaining his reliance on the dialectical analysis and applying it to the material world. And this dialectics is an extremely important methodology. It's an extremely important framework that Marx borrows from Hegel. And we will discuss what it means, but he rejects, Hegel was the proponent of dialectical idealism, whereas Marx was the proponent of dialectical materialism. Marx borrowed the idea of dialectics but rejected the idea of idealism. Marx combined his materialistic explanation of society with that of dialectics and provided and then presented this very fascinating theoretical explanation about social change, about the evolution of human society. It's a meta theory in that sense. It's an overarching theory. It's an overarching theory which has the, according to Marx, has the explanatory capacity to explain how human beings evolved, socially evolved and developed all these years, and what would be the course of action, what would be the trajectory of human civilization, human race in the future as well. So Marx, as a young Hegelian, was fascinated by his idealist philosophy. The ultimate conditions of human existence and development can be arrived at only through an examination of abstract philosophical categories. So this is the central idea of idealism. So Hegel argued that Marx, as a he belonged to what we understand it as a young Hegelian, a group of young scholars and intellectuals in Germany who declared themselves as the disciples or the people who are heavily influenced by Hegel's idea. So the argument is that the ultimate conditions of human existence and development can be arrived only through an examination of the abstract philosophical categories. So Hegel argued that the change in human civilization from a very primitive to that of the modern capitalist societies in Europe can be understood only by looking at the changes that happened in the abstract categories that governed human existence. And categories such as reason, existence and history were used to understand human existence, especially the close link between individual and society. So the Hegelian interpretation or Hegelian intellectual exercise revolved around understanding the reason, understanding these categories such as existence, history and reason, how these ideas were developed. How these ideas were developed in different epochs in human history, and how these ideas provide a new worldview, or how these ideas provide a new perspective to the world outside. So it was a study, or it was an engagement with a set of ideas as elaborated by Hegel. And these ideas, important ideas, include that of reason, existence and history. And at the same time, while Marx was initially influenced by these ideas, later he became increasingly impatient with the idealist interpretation of the world. He began to become restless because Hegel's and even many of the young Hegelians gave primacy to the ideas, almost discounting or almost neglecting the kind of an empirical reality around them. Because for them, empirical reality is only a product of this kind of idealist categories. In Hegel's word, idealism consists in nothing else than in recognizing that the finite has no veritable being. For Hegel, true reality is embodied in that which is discovered through reason. So it is almost kind of discounting, it's almost kind of refuting the existence of empirical reality out there, because this empirical reality is only a reflection of certain ideas, that the finite has no veritable being. And he argued that the reality is embodied in that which is discovered through reason. And this reason, you need to keep in mind that this is something quite different from the kind of rationality and reason that we discussed while we were talking about this enlightenment. in the empirical tradition, you talk about rationality, you talk about reason as you identify certain things through your empirical approaches. You collect information, you use your rationality, you use your reason, and to come up with kind of certain arguments. But here Hegel is talking about a different understanding of reason. From this point of view, the objects perceived by the senses are not real. You know, very interesting and controversial argument that there is no reality of existing objects out there. These reality is perceived through only our senses, because our senses provide you an illusion of reality out there. The objects perceived by the senses are not real. They are merely the phenomenon appearance and ultimate reality of ideas. Only logical objects or concepts constitute ultimate reality. Only logical objects or concepts constitute ultimate reality. As Hegel wrote, it is only in thought that an object is truly in and for itself. In intuition or ordinary perception, it is only an appearance. You know, it's, as I told you, it's almost like negating the existence of empirical reality, and objects exist only in our ideas, and it is only intuition or ordinary perception is only an appearance. It is only an appearance. Hegel asserted that if only concepts are real, then the ultimate concept is God. And Hegel's philosophy is essentially an attempt at proving the existence of God through the application of reason. This is again a very interesting point. Hegel was a believer. He was a strong believer. So ultimately, he developed these philosophical arguments about idealism, and then reached the conclusion that the ultimate reality is God. Asserted that if only concepts are real, then the ultimate concept is God, and Hegel's philosophy is essentially an attempt at proving the existence of God through the application of reason. So he argues how human beings develop this particular faculty of reason, and finally in the most developed societies or most advanced societies, they develop this particular faculty of reason to identify or to discover the importance of God. And Hegel argued that there was an inherent dialectical relationship between God, the infinite, and the people, the finite. The essence of this dialectics is contradiction. Each concept implies its opposite, or in Hegel's term, each concept implies its negation. So this is an extremely important methodological as well as philosophical tool that Hegel employs. This whole idea of dialectics, that an argument in itself contains its opposites, and an argument is able to develop further only when these two opposite ideas come together, and that leads, or that gives rise to or that gives birth to a qualitatively different set of ideas, again which has the kind of a contradictions inherent within that. The essence of dialectics is contradiction. Each concept implies its opposite, or in Hegel terms, each concept implies its negation. Now, Marx completely rejected Hegel's assertion that finite or empirical phenomena are not ultimately real. You know, we know that Marx, while started as a Hegelian, became a materialist who argued that the material conditions are the central in understanding human society. All his other criticism follow from this basic point, that is, that finite or empirical phenomena are the real, and that is a kind of a diametrically opposite position to that of Hegel. Marx believed that when empirical phenomena are understood only as thoughts, people's most significant practical problems are ignored. Because if you go by a Hegelian understanding, the real the real problems of people like poverty or exploitation or discrimination or injustice, so these actual problems will appear insignificant, because they can even be considered as unreal, because for Hegel these kind of empirical existence do not have any basis. Now, primacy of ideas over matter, this is another, as we discussed, this is another matter of contestation, Hegel's arguments about the centrality of ideas in shaping social change was unacceptable to Marx, who argued that ideas emerge from the concrete material conditions and has only secondary stature. And there is a very significant or very interesting debate about this whole idea of reason and spirit. So Hegel argued that especially the philosophers, the thinkers, they engage in critical reasoning about ideas, and they develop new ideas, and these new ideas are central in producing society on the basis of its own shape. So here, when Hegel gives primacy to ideas as the propelling force, ideas as the most important force behind social change, Marx took a completely diametrically opposite argument. He argued that the ideas are the products of social conditions. Ideas are the products of the material conditions. So here you will see a kind of a complete contradiction or complete polar opposite positions adopted by both Marx as well as Hegel. This primacy over matter or mind, or primacy over matter or ideas. Hegel's arguments about the centrality of ideas in shaping social change was unacceptable. It was criticized, and Marx argued that ideas emerge from concrete material conditions. A very fascinating argument, an extremely important argument which you will come to appreciate in the coming classes, and only has secondary status. While Hegel believed that freedom from oppression exists when individuals change their consciousness, Marx argued that they arise from class differences and exploitation. Hegel's arguments about the slave and the master and the change of consciousness. And this is again a set of very fascinating discussions and debates about them. For example, Hegel believed that the freedom from expression exists only when individuals change their consciousness. He argued that the whole idea that human beings are or human beings are free or not is purely a function of your thinking. It's only purely a function of your consciousness. It has nothing much to do with the kind of true empirical reality in which you are embedded in. Okay, so you decide, your consciousness decides, or your consciousness plays a very important role in defining whether you are free or not. On the other hand, Marx absolutely disagreed with these arguments, and he argued that whether somebody is free or not, somebody is kept in a subjugated position or not, is an empirical reality. It has nothing to do with his consciousness of being free or not. Your status as a slave or your status as a serf does not change if you change your thinking. And this is very closely connected with quite a lot of spiritual arguments that you are able to change your life by changing the kind of thinking that you have. So a lot of the spiritual gurus, spiritual teachers would urge you to make fundamental changes in your thinking, with the promise that will bring about positive changes in your life. Whereas Marx had a completely different argument. Marx argued that until and unless your empirical situation changes, your thinking will not change, and your thinking cannot have a kind of a change or cannot have an impact that will alter your material existence. So Hegel's arguments about the slave and the master, this is a extremely important and very philosophically very deep argument about the identity formation between the slave and the master, or in other words, it's known as the lord and the bondsman. So it talks about how the kind of a reciprocal identification, reciprocal understanding plays a very important role in providing identity to both the slave as well as the master. I am not going into the details. And the change of the consciousness. This is a quote from Marx. In a simple example, if people are alienated such that they have no control over their lives or the material things produced by the labor, they cannot end their alienation by changing their perception of reality or by praying for that matter. Rather, people must change the social structure in which they live. That is, they must make a revolution in this world rather than wait for the next world. And this particular quotation has also very interesting implications to Marxian discussion on religion, which we will take up in one of the coming sessions. So this is a very, very fascinating argument. He argues that if people are alienated such that they have no control over their lives or the material things produced by their labor, they cannot change, and for Marx that is the reality. If you think of a proletariat, if you think of a factory worker, somebody like Charlie Chaplin, whom we saw in the previous class in that film, The Modern Times, he cannot change his reality of being an alienated person simply by changing his thinking. Changing his thinking as being completely free does not make any change in his lived reality. His lived reality is heavily influenced by the kind of material condition in which he is implicated. He is a proletariat, he is a worker who sells his body, who sells his labor, and who is subjected to extremely inhuman conditions in the workplace. So that pathetic situation, that deplorable situation will not change just because of he changing his perception, or even changing his perception of reality, or by praying for that matter. Rather, people must change the social structure within which they live. That is, they must make a revolution in this world rather than wait for the next world. A very powerful argument. It's an extremely powerful argument because there is no heaven, there is no hell waiting for you. The hell as well as heaven is in this world, and you need to bring in change. You need to change this particular world rather than wait for the next world. Second, according to Marx, Hegel's emphasis on the ultimate reality of thought led him to misperceive some of the essential characteristics of human beings. For example, Marx contends that although Hegel correctly grasps labor at the essence of man, the only labor which he knows and recognizes is abstract mental labor. Yet people have physical needs, Marx noted, such as those for food, clothing and shelter, which can be satisfied only by productive activity in the finite world. Hence, for Marx, the most significant labor is productive activity rather than mental activity. This is yet another very central and extremely important and central theme. While Hegel understood that labor is important, the primary focus of Hegel was on mental activity, on how human beings think, how human beings work on the realms of ideas, how human beings collectively come up with certain new ideas and philosophically new insights, and how that shapes the world. Whereas for Marx, that was only secondary, because human beings, like any other animals, have got their own physical needs, and these physical needs need to be met. And the productive activity, the centrality of Marxian thought revolves around the ability of human beings to engage in productive activity. We will have a detailed discussion about this topic in the coming classes. So Marx foregrounds that human beings as a species, how they are differently positioned in comparison with other animals to engage in productive activities, and that not only provides them with the physical needs of food, shelter and other things, but also provide them with a unique sense of being human. Your sense of being human being, or your sense of being uniquely different from other animals, is derived from your ability to engage in productive activity. So this labor as productive activity was central to Karl Marx in comparison with Hegel, who gave primacy to the mental labor, or to the activity of thinking. Marx disagreed with Hegel on his idea of the state, another point of discussion or debate. For Hegel, the state was developed out of the forces of spirit in history and the actualization of the ethical. Marx criticized this argument that the state represents a theological embodiment of the spirit of human beings. Marx did not agree with these formulations. For Hegel, the state as a collective entity that is able to rule over the rest of the people is a manifestation of their ethical predispositions, that human beings have reached that highest pedestal, or they have traveled so much from the previous state of affairs, so that they are in a position to lead a kind of a collective life by creating this entity called as a state. And that is, many times he presents it as a kind of a theological embodiment. of the spirit of human beings as the highest form of human reason. Human reason has reached that highest position. And Marx completely rejects all these arguments. Marx has a completely different take on state that we will discuss later. So Marx rejected the religious motive that pervades Hegel's work. As I told you, Marx was an atheist, whereas Hegel was a believer. As noted earlier, Hegel denied actuality to the finite world to prove the existence of God, albeit a Christian God. And a person like Hegel, or for that matter, every philosopher of that particular time, if they had to conceive of a God, it has to be a Christian God. And Christianity, it really influenced their way of thinking, its sensibilities, its imagery, its theological ideas. All these aspects have fundamentally shaped the thinking of European philosophers during this particular time. Nevertheless, Marx believed that through such arguments, people are prevented from recognizing that they are exploited and they have an interest in changing the status quo in this world. For Marx, the next world is a religious fantasy, not worth worrying about. So as we mentioned briefly, and as we are going to discuss more elaborately in one of the coming classes, that Marx did not believe in a world hereafter. He did not believe in a life hereafter. He did not believe in God. He did not believe in any force or spirit that completely decides or defines or determines the state of affairs. He believed that the only real is the world in which we live. And he very passionately believed that human beings have the ability to change it. Human beings have the ability to shape it. Unlike that of Hegel, who believed that there is a supernatural power, there is a Christian God who has decided everything for human beings. So, on the other hand, Marx accepts Hegel's dialectical method, as we discussed. So, while Marx was critical of this idealist slant or idealistic orientation of Hegelian argument, he completely accepted the dialectical method. Despite his complete rejection of idealism, Marx was a significant tool in Hegel's use of the dialectics. In Hegel's hands, however, the entire analysis is couched in terms of a mystical theology. Thus, as Marx noted in Capital, his important work, Hegel's dialectics is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again. If you would discover the rational, discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. So, Marx uses this dialectical method, which was already developed by Hegel, but couched in a idealist language, and then argues that if the rational kernel of human society has to be retrieved, it must be retrieved from Hegel, because it is within a mystical shell. The entire philosophy of Hegel appears as if, or it is a mythical, it is encased in a mythical shell, and if you need to retrieve its rational kernel, you need to move beyond, or you need to move out of its mysticism. You need to move out of the idealism as propounded by Marx. And he used these dialectical methods in a materialist explanation that we will discuss in detail, how he used this logic of dialectics, that is opposite forces coming together to create a qualitatively new one, which again has inherent contradictions, as a kind of a continuous process. How he used this dialectical method in a materialist explanation is what we need to understand as his argument about historical materialism or dialectical materialism, which we will discuss in the coming class. And Marx also had very interesting engagement with other young Hegelians, one being this Ludwig Feuerbach, and in his book The Essence of Christianity, Feuerbach criticizes idealist philosophers such as Hegel's that equate the progress of humankind with the advance of spirit or abstract reason. So there are a lot of agreements between Hegel and Marx and Feuerbach, because both of them were critical of the excessive idealist orientation in Hegelian thought. So Feuerbach argues that the starting point of the study of humanity must be real people living in the material world, something very similar to that of Marx. People are natural beings. The real does not emanate from the divine, but from the nature. In fact, people project their real powers into the ideas of a god, creating a fantasy religious world of harmony and beauty, while their real world is one of pain and misery. So Feuerbach did not agree with the Hegelian understanding of God. Rather, he argued that human beings are projecting their positive qualities onto an entity called as God and then create such an entity. And they think that they are creating a fantasy, a religious world of harmony and beauty, while real world is one of pain and misery. So Feuerbach argued that the religion is in a way is an escape route. Human beings are projecting all their good qualities or all desirable qualities which they are never able to achieve into an imaginary entity and call it as God, and then live in a real world of misery and difficulties. So Marx adopts much of Feuerbach's materialism, but contends that Feuerbach does not sufficiently comprehend the material circumstances can be altered through conscious social change. So Marx is extremely appreciative of Feuerbach's arguments about the primacy of material, but he argues that he does not really comprehend the innate logic of this material condition. And Feuerbach approach is ahistorical, for he posits an abstract human nature that exists outside society and does not understand that people change as society changes. For Marx, Feuerbach presents as the human society or as human beings as having a given set of mental preoccupations or given set of mental orientations. He does not identify, or he is not sensitive to the kind of a historical transformations. He is not able to really understand how different epochs in history is able to create different ideas of human beings, a different ideological contribution, different set of ideas. So people can actively change the world, and it is this interaction between humankind and the material world developing through the history that forms the basis of Marxism. So Marx argued that human beings have the ability to change the world. Every historical epochs, every historical time period have created its own specific social structure, and human beings have actively engaged with that. They were the one who changed it to the next level, and that agency of human beings is missing in the arguments of Feuerbach according to Marx. And their debate on religion, which we will take it up later. I just brought it to mention that one of the contentious areas between these two scholars is the field of religion. So we will continue with his ideas on historical materialism in the coming class. Thank you.